The mayor waited until the final vote was public. Cameras were rolling when he folded the condemnation papers across the diner counter and told Walter Boone he had 30 days to vacate the last 40 acres his family still owned outside Bell County. Most people in the room looked away after that. Walter didn't argue. He only stared at the folded survey map beside the coffee machine and asked one quiet question that made the town attorney stop writing mid-sentence. Did they search the railroad archive before filing this? Nobody answered him. But 3 weeks later, the town's $30 million industrial project stopped moving overnight. And somebody inside City Hall started offering Walter Boone money to stay quiet. Walter Boone ran the same roadside diner his father opened in 1974 beside the abandoned Midland Southern rail line outside Bell County. The building was small, narrow, and permanently stained with decades of coffee steam and fryer grease. Most mornings started the same way, kettle whistling at dawn, handwritten invoices stacked beside the register, local ranchers eating eggs beneath fading train photographs nobody noticed anymore. The land behind the diner was the important part. 40 acres of dry pasture and creek access sitting directly between the county highway and the proposed Red Ridge Logistics Hub, a distribution project the mayor had promised would modernize Bell County. Warehouses. Truck routes. Tax revenue. Jobs. Every council meeting repeated the same language until it sounded rehearsed. Walter refused to sell. Not loudly. Not emotionally. He simply kept saying the same sentence. My family already buried one generation protecting this land. The mayor, Richard Vance, treated Walter like a stubborn inconvenience from another era. Vance was polished, educated, always surrounded by consultants carrying rolled blueprints and tablets. He believed rural resistance could be solved procedurally. Surveys. Hearings. Eminent domain filings. Pressure from tax assessors. The county newspaper painted Walter as an obstacle standing in the way of progress. Then came the public hearing. The room smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee. Walter sat alone in the back wearing his weathered denim jacket while attorneys projected development maps onto a portable screen. The mayor spoke carefully for the cameras. Unused land cannot hold back economic survival. People clapped. Walter never reacted. Then the condemnation approval passed unanimously. Afterward, the mayor personally delivered the seizure documents to Walter's diner in front of reporters. It wasn't legally necessary. That was intentional. Humiliation was part of the performance. Walter unfolded the papers slowly beside the pie case. One survey map slipped partially loose from the stack. His eyes stopped there. Not on the condemnation order. Not on the compensation amount. On a thin faded line running across the western edge of the property. Abandoned rail corridor easement, 1961. The room stayed quiet while Walter studied it. The mayor mistook the silence for surrender. What happens now, Vance said calmly, is simply procedure. Walter folded the map carefully. Then he asked the question nobody expected. Did your people check who still owns transit access rights on the western corridor? The town attorney stopped typing. Only for a second. But Walter noticed. That night, after closing the diner, Walter unlocked a rusted filing cabinet in the storage room behind the kitchen. Inside were old county receipts, notebooks, survey sketches, railroad maintenance invoices, and a yellow legal folder his father labeled in black marker nearly 40 years earlier. Midland Southern, do not throw away. Walter placed the folder beside the coffee pot and finally opened it. Introduced documentary evidence, hidden ownership complications, and the first signs of corporate vulnerability. The diner stayed open through the next week as if nothing had changed. Walter still served coffee before sunrise. Still wiped counters with the same faded towel hanging from his apron loop. Truckers passing through Bell County noticed the condemnation notice taped beside the register, but nobody mentioned it directly. Rural towns had their own rules about humiliation. People looked away to avoid becoming part of it. At night, Walter read. The yellow legal folder contained 40 years of forgotten paper. Railroad tax receipts. Maintenance contracts. Hand-drawn utility maps. Easement renewals typed on onion skin paper from the early 1960s. Most of it looked useless at first glance. But Walter wasn't searching emotionally. He was searching patiently. His father, Earl Boone, had once worked maintenance for Midland Southern Railroad before the rail line shut down in the late 1980s. Earl kept records obsessively. Dates. Access paths. County signatures. Crossing permissions. Small handwritten notes in narrow blue ink. Walter found one notation repeated 3 separate times. Transit rights survive abandonment if utility continuity remains active. No explanation beside it. Just that sentence. The next morning, Walter drove 30 miles to the Bell County Records Annex, a low brick building beside the old courthouse annex where most people only went for property tax disputes or probate filings. The archive clerk recognized him immediately. "You fighting the seizure?" Walter removed his hat politely. "Just checking old surveys." The clerk nodded toward the basement records room. Dust floated through weak fluorescent lighting while Walter rolled open steel drawers filled with survey maps older than the interstate highway system. He spent nearly 4 hours tracing parcel boundaries and abandoned rail markings across overlapping county plats. Then he found the discrepancy. The Logistics Project survey showed the rail easement as inactive. But the 1961 Transportation Agreement classified the Western Corridor differently. Protected commercial transit continuity. Walter read the phrase twice. A later amendment from 1978 included something even stranger: any obstruction blocking future freight reactivation required approval from every surviving easement beneficiary, including adjacent agricultural access holders. His family name appeared twice. Walter sat motionless at the archive table. The county had approved construction across protected transit ground without verifying surviving easement obligations. Which meant one thing. If the easement remained legally active in any form, the entire logistics project could face federal transportation review before construction financing finalized. Walter copied every document himself. No attorneys yet. No confrontation. Just paper. That evening, a black SUV appeared outside the diner shortly before closing. A man in a pressed gray jacket entered carrying no menu, no appetite, no introduction. He placed a business card beside Walter's coffee mug. Dalton Pierce. Regional Acquisition Consultant for Red Ridge Infrastructure Partners. Corporate side. "We're authorized to improve the compensation package," Pierce said quietly. Walter kept drying a coffee cup. "You people move fast." Pierce smiled slightly. "Economic projects don't wait." Walter slid the copied easement papers beneath the counter before answering. "Neither do railroad obligations." For the first time, the consultant's expression changed. Only briefly. But it was enough. He asked to see the documents. Walter refused politely. Pierce left without touching the coffee Walter poured for him. An hour later, long after midnight, Walter sat alone in the diner kitchen listening to the tea kettle hum softly while county maps covered the table around him. Then he noticed something else. One missing signature page referenced in the 1978 amendment. Filed separately. Location unknown. And without it, the easement challenge might still collapse in court. Walter stared at the note for a long time before writing down 3 words inside his father's notebook. Find the signature. Reveal that the town's legal timeline is collapsing beneath unnoticed historical records. 3 days passed before Walter told anyone what he had found. Even then, he only told one person. Clara Boone arrived at the diner before sunrise carrying a grocery sack filled with old photographs from her attic. She was Earl Boone's younger sister, 72 years old, sharp-eyed, and stubborn enough to remember details most people forgot. Walter poured her coffee while rain tapped softly against the front windows. "You look tired," she said. Walter slid the notebook across the counter. "Do you remember anything about Midland Southern filing separate easement amendments?" Clara adjusted her glasses slowly. She read the phrase twice before looking toward the railroad photographs hanging above the booths. "Your father thought the county cheated them during the line closure." Walter stayed quiet. Clara lowered her voice. There was a meeting in '78. Federal people came down from Louisville. Utilities were involved. Something about fuel transport access. That caught Walter's attention immediately. What utilities? I don't remember. She did remember something else, though. The railroad kept duplicate filings inside the old freight depot before the demolition in 1991. Most records were supposedly transferred to state storage afterward, but Earl believed some boxes disappeared before inventory processing finished. Your father got angry about it for years, Clara said softly. Said certain people preferred those papers stay missing. That afternoon, Walter drove 2 counties west to the Kentucky Transportation Archive Facility, a converted warehouse filled with shelving units stacked floor to ceiling with retired infrastructure records. The receptionist looked surprised anyone under 80 years old had entered the building voluntarily. Walter spent hours reviewing retired freight agreements, utility corridor maps, and decommissioned filings. Most led nowhere. Then he found a maintenance index card. Midland Southern, Corridor Utility Continuation Review, Supplemental Authorization attached. Archive Box 14C, 117. Missing. Removed July 1998. No destination listed. Walter copied the withdrawal log carefully. The removal authorization signature belonged to Thomas Heller, current legal counsel for Red Ridge Infrastructure Partners. Walter leaned back slowly in the archive chair. That was the first moment the situation stopped feeling accidental. Back in Bell County, construction crews had already begun preliminary grading near the highway entrance. Survey stakes appeared across neighboring fields. Local radio stations praised the project daily. The mayor smiled through interviews beside architectural renderings nobody questioned closely. But inside City Hall, tension had started leaking quietly. Walter noticed it during the next county planning session. The town attorney avoided eye contact. The mayor's assistant whispered constantly during recesses. 2 unfamiliar men in suits sat along the back wall reviewing binders marked Transport Review. Nobody acknowledged Walter directly. Which meant they were paying attention now. After the meeting, Dalton Pierce approached Walter outside beneath the courthouse awning while rainwater streamed through broken gutters nearby. You've created unnecessary delays, Pierce said. Walter folded his umbrella carefully. Not intentionally. Pierce handed him another offer sheet. Triple the original amount. Walter barely glanced at it. What happens if Federal Transit Review opens? He asked quietly. Pierce's jaw tightened. These projects involve thousands of jobs. Walter nodded once. Then somebody should have checked the easements before taking my land. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Rain hammered the courthouse steps between them. Finally Pierce asked the question Walter had been waiting for. What exactly do you have? Walter looked past him toward the construction site, lights glowing faintly beyond town. Not enough yet. That answer unsettled Pierce more than any threat could have. Because it meant Walter was still searching. And somewhere inside Bell County's forgotten paperwork, there was still something missing powerful enough to stop everything entirely. Late that night, Walter returned to the diner storage room and reopened his father's filing cabinet. Behind the bottom drawer panel, taped beneath the wood frame itself, he discovered an old envelope Earl Boone had hidden decades earlier. Inside was a faded Polaroid photograph. 3 men standing beside railroad survey markers in 1978. One of them was Thomas Heller. And behind them sat a pipeline warning sign the county maps never mentioned. Connect the railroad corridor to active utility infrastructure capable of freezing the entire development project. Walter pinned the Polaroid beneath the diner's kitchen light and studied it until nearly 2 in the morning. The image was grainy, faded by time, but certain details remained clear enough to matter. Railroad markers. Survey stakes. Thomas Heller standing beside 2 unidentified engineers wearing Midland Southern maintenance jackets. And behind them, partially obscured by weeds, the warning sign. Trans-County Fuel Transfer Line. Walter recognized the company name immediately. The pipeline once carried aviation fuel through 3 counties before portions of the route were privatized during the late 1980s. Most people assumed the Bell County segment had been abandoned decades ago. But assumptions were what created problems like this. The next morning, Walter drove to the public library instead of the courthouse. Older legal disputes often left traces in local newspapers long after official records disappeared. He sat beside a microfilm machine for almost 5 hours feeding reels through the humming projector while handwritten notes filled his father's notebook one line at a time. Finally, he found the article. July 12, 1978. Federal Review delays rail closure negotiations. The story mentioned Midland Southern negotiating emergency utility continuity protections connected to regional fuel transportation contingencies. Most of the article focused on labor disputes and railway downsizing, but one paragraph caught Walter's attention immediately. Shared infrastructure easements may remain federally protected if future transport access is deemed strategically necessary. Walter copied the article twice. Then he found something worse. A smaller follow-up article from 1981 mentioned a confidential settlement involving Bell County officials and private land redevelopment interests tied to future industrial zoning rights near the Western Corridor. One county official quoted in the article was a young deputy clerk named Richard Vance's father. Walter removed his glasses slowly. The pattern was becoming clearer now. This wasn't a forgotten mistake. Families inside Bell County had known about the corridor complications for decades. They simply assumed nobody else still remembered. That afternoon, Walter received a certified letter from Red Ridge Infrastructure Partners requesting private settlement discussions regarding potential historical property ambiguities. The language alone told him everything he needed to know. Corporate attorneys were scared enough to stop pretending the issue was insignificant. Walter never responded. Instead, he visited the old rail corridor personally for the first time in years. Tall grass swallowed most of the abandoned tracks now, but fragments remained beneath the weeds, rusted bolts, signal posts, mile markers nearly hidden under vines. He followed the western line until he found a faded concrete utility marker half buried beside the creek. Pipeline access corridor. Still active. Someone had painted over the warning numbers years ago, but federal utility identification codes remained stamped into the concrete itself. Walter photographed everything carefully. At sunset, 2 county SUVs appeared on the dirt access road behind him. Not police. Inspectors. They stepped out carrying folders and cameras, surprised to find Walter already standing there. One of them attempted a polite smile. Environmental review. Walter nodded toward the marker. Little late for that. Neither man answered. The older inspector finally asked, "Who told you about the pipeline?" Walter closed his notebook. "My father." That response unsettled them visibly. Because dead men were harder to negotiate with. That night, Walter returned home to find someone waiting outside the diner in a black sedan. Dalton Pierce stepped out holding no paperwork this time. No contracts. No rehearsed corporate language. Only urgency. "We can still resolve this privately," Pierce said quietly. Walter unlocked the diner door without inviting him inside. "You already tried that." Pierce hesitated before speaking again. If federal transit and utility reviews open simultaneously, financing collapses. Construction stops. The county loses everything. Walter looked across the dark highway toward the silent rail corridor beyond the fields. Then he asked the question Pierce clearly feared most. "How long has your company known the pipeline was still active?" Pierce said nothing. And silence was answer enough. Force the county and corporate partners into defensive action as Walter closes in on the missing authorization document. By the following Monday, Bell County stopped talking about progress. Now people talked about delays. Construction equipment sat motionless behind temporary fencing near the highway interchange. County workers blamed weather publicly, but everybody could see the skies had been clear for days. Local contractors whispered about emergency legal reviews. Vendors stopped receiving payment approvals. Even the mayor's weekly radio interview was cancelled without explanation. Walter noticed something else too. Strangers had started eating at the diner. Not travelers. Not ranchers. Attorneys. They arrived alone carrying leather folders and speaking carefully into muted phones near the front windows. Some pretended to study menus while quietly watching Walter move between tables refilling coffee. None of them mentioned the land seizure directly. Which meant the situation was already worse than public officials admitted. Late Tuesday afternoon, Clara called the diner from the county clerk's office where she occasionally volunteered organizing probate files. "You need to come down here," she whispered. Walter arrived 20 minutes later. Clara led him into a basement records room rarely used by anyone under retirement age. Filing cabinets lined the walls beneath buzzing fluorescent lights while old deed books sat stacked across folding tables waiting for archival processing. Clara pointed toward a cart filled with recently transferred documents. "Those weren't here yesterday." Walter immediately recognized the labels. Transportation Litigation Archives. Most boxes were sealed, but one folder near the top had been opened carelessly in a hurry. Walter removed the papers slowly while Clara watched the hallway nervously. Inside sat meeting summaries from a closed infrastructure review held in August 1981. Present: County zoning officials, Midland Southern representatives, private development attorneys, federal utility advisors, and Thomas Heller. Walter scanned the pages quickly until one paragraph stopped him cold. Continuation protections remain enforceable unless corridor beneficiaries formally relinquish future freight and utility access through signed dissolution authorization. Signed dissolution authorization. That was the missing page. Without it, the easement protections likely remained active permanently. Walter checked the attachment inventory listed at the bottom. Document removed for supplemental legal retention, T. Heller. He closed the folder slowly. The paper existed. And Thomas Heller had personally removed it decades earlier. Footsteps echoed down the hallway suddenly. Clara pushed the folder back onto the cart just before two county administrators entered the records room carrying inventory sheets. Their expressions changed immediately when they saw Walter standing there. One administrator forced a smile. "Public access areas upstairs." Walter nodded politely and left without argument. But 30 minutes later, someone pulled the entire archive cart from public processing. Too late. Walter had already photographed every page. That evening, a confidential emergency meeting took place inside Bell County Municipal Hall. Walter wasn't invited, but he learned about it anyway from a waitress whose cousin cleaned council offices overnight. The mayor. Corporate attorneys. State transportation consultants. Financial lenders. Everybody was suddenly involved now. Because lenders had discovered something catastrophic. If federal regulators determined the county knowingly concealed active corridor protections during condemnation proceedings, project financing could trigger fraud exposure clauses. Not just delays. Collapse. Around midnight, Dalton Pierce arrived at the diner again, this time visibly exhausted. His tie hung loose. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of his coat. Walter served him coffee without speaking. Pierce slid a folded document across the counter. Settlement proposal. $8 million. Private confidentiality agreement included. Walter stared at the number for several seconds before pushing it back untouched. "This was never about money," he said quietly. Pierce rubbed both hands across his face. "You could destroy this town." Walter looked toward the old railroad photographs hanging above the booths. "No," he said softly. "They did that themselves." Pierce lowered his voice carefully after that. "There's still one document you haven't found." Walter said nothing. But Pierce's expression confirmed it. The dissolution authorization still existed somewhere. And whoever possessed it controlled the fate of the entire project. Conclude the conflict through realistic legal collapse, institutional accountability, and restrained emotional payoff. Walter did not sleep that night. He sat alone inside the diner after closing while the tea kettle clicked softly on the back burner and rain drifted against the windows in slow uneven waves. Earl Boone's notebook remained open beside the register beneath a yellow hanging light. Walter reread every handwritten note from the past 40 years searching for something he had missed. Near dawn, he found it. Not a legal reference. An address. Written beside one short sentence in Earl's narrow handwriting. Harrison keeps copies when nobody else should. Walter recognized the name immediately. Leonard Harrison had been Midland Southern's regional claims supervisor during the rail shutdown years. Most people assumed he died long ago, but Clara remembered hearing he moved into assisted living outside Lexington after his wife passed away. Walter left before sunrise. The facility sat beside an old church road nearly 3 hours away. Harrison was 91 years old, thin as paper, wrapped in a gray blanket beside a window overlooking winter fields. At first he barely remembered Bell County. Then Walter mentioned Thomas Heller. Everything changed. That man, Harrison said quietly, wanted those corridors erased. Walter listened without interrupting. Harrison explained the entire situation slowly, one careful detail at a time. During the late 1970s, federal transportation advisors required Midland Southern to preserve emergency freight and utility access routes tied to regional fuel infrastructure. Certain counties opposed the restrictions because protected corridors limited future industrial redevelopment. Bell County fought hardest. Developers wanted unrestricted access decades before the logistics project ever existed. So negotiations began privately. Some officials pushed for dissolution agreements that would terminate surviving easement protections permanently. Most failed because adjacent landholders refused to sign away future access rights. Including Earl Boone. He knew what they were trying to do, Harrison whispered. Walter finally asked the question that mattered most. Did the dissolution authorization ever get completed? Harrison looked directly at him. No. Then the old man opened a small lockbox beside his chair. Inside sat a sealed Midland Southern Records envelope untouched for decades. The unsigned dissolution authorization. And attached behind it, a federal continuity memorandum stating all corridor protections remained active indefinitely unless every listed beneficiary signed voluntary release forms. The Boone family never had. By noon the next day, Walter's attorney filed emergency motions with state transportation regulators and federal utility oversight offices simultaneously. Construction financing froze within hours. County Condemnation Authority suspended pending investigation. Red Ridge Infrastructure Partners halted all activity across the corridor indefinitely. Mayor Richard Vance held a press conference that evening. He looked older already. Reporters asked whether county officials knowingly ignored historical easement protections during land seizure proceedings. Vance avoided direct answers. Behind him, corporate representatives refused to speak entirely. 3 days later, Red Ridge withdrew from the project. 2 weeks after that, state investigators opened formal reviews into archival suppression and disclosure failures tied to Bell County redevelopment approvals dating back decades. Walter never appeared on television. Never celebrated publicly. Never sued for revenge. The diner stayed open exactly the same as before. Same coffee steam. Same cracked booths. Same railroad photographs along the walls. One cold morning near the end of October, Clara entered carrying fresh pie boxes while Walter stood outside watching sunlight settle across the abandoned rail corridor behind the property. "You finally won," she said softly. Walter looked toward the rusted tracks disappearing beyond the fields. Then he folded Earl Boone's notebook carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "My father did," he answered. The wind moved quietly through the dry grass where construction equipment used to stand. And for the first time in months, Bell County was silent. Close the story with symbolic permanence and understated justice. Winter arrived early that year. By December, frost covered the abandoned rail corridor every morning before sunrise, turning the old track silver beneath the field grass. Most of the construction fencing had already been removed. The temporary trailers disappeared next. Then the survey markers. Then the county signs announcing the future Red Ridge Logistics Hub. Within months, it was almost as if the project had never existed. Except people remembered. Bell County talked differently now whenever Walter Boone walked into a room. Not dramatically. Rural towns rarely apologized out loud. But the silence around him had changed. The same man who once avoided eye contact during the condemnation hearings now nodded respectfully when they entered the diner before dawn. Nobody mentioned the $8 million settlement offer anymore. What lingered instead were the investigations. State auditors discovered years of redevelopment shortcuts hidden inside county filing procedures. Several archived transportation reviews had been improperly classified. Easement disclosures were inconsistently reported during land acquisition negotiations tied to industrial zoning projects stretching back nearly 15 years. Nothing explosive happened publicly. No arrests. No dramatic courtroom speeches. Just careers quietly ending. Consultants resigning. Contracts disappearing. People retiring earlier than expected. Mayor Richard Vance did not run for re-election the following spring. Thomas Heller left Red Ridge Infrastructure Partners before the federal inquiry formally concluded. Official statements described it as a mutual transition decision. Nobody in Bell County believed that explanation for a second. Walter followed none of it closely. Every morning remained simple. Unlock the diner. Start the coffee. Check invoices. Listen to the kettle. But one habit changed permanently. Each Thursday evening after closing, Walter walked the western edge of the property carrying Earl Boone's old notebook beneath his arm. He followed the abandoned corridor all the way to the creek where the faded utility marker still stood partially buried in the grass. The county offered several times to purchase easement access rights afterward. Walter declined every offer. Not because the land had become valuable. Because some things only survived when somebody refused to surrender them. Late one afternoon near Christmas, Clara brought Walter a cardboard archive box recovered from the courthouse during records reorganization. Inside sat additional Midland Southern papers, old survey photographs, and one final envelope addressed in Earl Boone's handwriting. Walter opened it carefully at the diner counter. Inside was a single folded note. If they ever come back for the corridor, make them prove every inch. Walter stared at the sentence for a long time while evening light settled across the empty booths. Then he smiled for the first time in the entire ordeal. Small. Private. Almost invisible. Outside, beyond the highway and winter fields, the abandoned railroad line remained exactly where it had always been. Waiting.